There's a strange thing that sometimes happens, especially in the world of music and entertainment and film. When the world discovers a great new artist, great new performer, director, whatever it might be, not long after, this thing comes along and tends to just ruin everything. And that original performer, that original artist that we fell in love with in the first place has now changed forever. We'll never have them back. This happens in the watch world too, believe it or not. And many years ago it happened to the most famous watch brand of all. And this thing that I keep referring to, this awful thing, is called success.
It all happened so slowly. Most men failed to realize anything had happened at all. How did we go from this to this, or this to this? When did it stop being a watch and start being a circus? This brand began as tool watches, companions on the wrist, But the problem was, it did it a little too well. And so, the mania began.
It's easy to forget this, but when Rolex first hit the scene, they weren't the flashy, high society status symbol that they are today. That came much later. The fancier watches were, solid gold, three-handers, very slim, very elegant, like the Longines, Omega, and so on. Rolex hit the scene and they were rugged, aggressive tool watches. They were supposed to be used and abused. The very first water-resistant case was from Rolex, the Oyster. Then eventually we started seeing them on the silver screen. Sean Connery as James Bond, the ultimate badass, wearing his Rolex Submariner. And then, of course, the whole GMT Pan Am thing. Back then, it was the coolest thing in the world to be an airline pilot.
Are you a real life pilot?
I sure am, little lady. And what's your name?
Celine.
Celine, it's a pleasure to meet you.
So these associations started building up the brand's image. And of course, the fact that they were beautifully built watches, very resilient. It became a symbol of excellence, so much so that men would feel almost lucky to be wearing one. Like it was a good look charm. With your Rolex on, you were invincible, you could do anything. But somewhere along the lines, in the 1970s or 80s, things started to change. The brand began to really become a status symbol for many. We started seeing in the catalogue a lot of releases that erred on the side of jewellery more than on the side of utility. They held on to their strong image, the reliable watch, dependable watch, waterproof, and so on. But we started seeing things like gold being introduced, diamonds, Jubilee bracelets, things like that. And before you know it, you had a brand that was more about the aesthetic and the status symbol than the utility. We started seeing Submariners and Daytonas in two-tone and even full gold. And even though they continue making the stainless steel versions, you really get the feeling like Rolex are admitting nobody's buying these watches as tools anymore. But their original identity remained intact in the Sea Dweller and Explorer lines. They were still the true steel tool watches in the catalogue. But in 2019, they announced a 43mm Sea Dweller in two-tone. A beautiful watch, but met with outcry from the real Rolex aficionados. It seemed the only pages of the catalogue that remained unscathed were those of the Explorer, until last year when they announced an Explorer 1 in two-tone, leaving the Explorer 2 as the last remaining of the original catalogue. So all these years later, you have two different kind of Rolex buyers, two different fans of the brand. You have the guys who are after the diamonds and the flashy and the sparkly, the precious metal and so on, and they really are looking for the shiniest thing they can put on their wrist to turn heads as they walk down the street. But then you have the real Rolex fans, the guys who are prouder to wear an old 5512 and 5513. These are the true Rolex fans. These are the guys who love Rolex for what they began doing. So what you really have here is the entire Rolex catalog just becoming kind of a circus act. It's becoming kind of farce. They're just making museum pieces, relics of their original tool watches, their original icons. Even the Explorer 1, pains me to say it, but last year they brought out a two-tone version. That's going against the whole spirit of the Explorer. It's supposed to be a resilient steel adventurer's watch. Who the hell is taking a gold Explorer up into the mountains? But at the same time, we're not going up into the mountains with these watches anyway, are we? And I think Rolex know that. It's as if Rolex are really conceding to the reality that their watches are no longer being used for what they were originally designed for. The Explorer 2 remains kind of the final trace of that original thing.
With time, Rolex itself became an icon. A symbol. And as the years passed, those who bought its timepieces were doing so less and less for utility and more for the name. Until eventually, that terrible day came. When Rolex began to idolize itself. We pretend to ourselves that it matters how deep the watch can go underwater, or how accurate it is. But it doesn't matter. What matters is what it says on the dial. They went from making the finest tool watches in the world to a fashion brand. Pieces in gold and platinum that have no business being so. It was a museum, a gallery, filled with ornamented versions of its icons. A watch made to withstand the pressures of immense depths, but will never see the ocean. A watch made to time races to split-second accuracy, that will never see a racetrack. Little by little, it became all for show.
I was in a rock band for most of my life, and I've had many different guitars, bass guitars. But the one that I fell in love with the most and became really my sound and my identity was from a certain American brand by the name of Rickenbacker. Very strange instruments they made. A little bit alternative, but had a unmistakable sound. And as a kid, I would listen to my idols in music, guys like Chris Squire and Geddy Lee. They would play this exact bass, and I really fell in love with the sound. But when I first saw one, it wasn't exactly the prettiest instrument I've ever seen. It didn't have that lovely lush wooden veneer or gorgeous deep sunburst colors or anything. It was quite flat and quite functional and a little kind of goofy looking as a bass, honestly. But with the years, I began to fall in love with that form. Whenever I would see one in a photo, I would just gasp. So what happened right there is a particular phenomenon that happens in the world where people find the utility first, the function first, and then begin to fall in love with the form. It's a thing that happens in art, it happens in industry, in so many things. The thing is built in a certain way to achieve something, but then we start to find the immense beauty in that thing because of it. I also love the fact that the base looked the same in black and white photos as it did in color. Nothing really changed. And this watch reminds me of that base. It's built to last. It's built with a particular function in mind. And whatever beauty we find in the watch comes after and because of those purposes. No, it doesn't have any real high gloss parts. It doesn't have sparkling diamonds or any gold. But there's a certain elegance in what it does have. That all satin finish, that big white dial so you can easily read the time no matter what the conditions around you. All of these things come together to make something of beauty without trying to make it beautiful in the first place. The beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Knowing what the watch represents and what it can do leads you to finding the beauty in it later. Now, of course, they updated the form of the Explorer 1 and Explorer 2 and made them larger. The Explorer 2 went from 40 mils to 42. That's what I have on here, the 216570. And some people consider that sacrilege. They're like, oh no, it's not the same as it was. Well, I don't think that comes under the same category. I mean, it's not like they made a meteorite dial version or diamonds or made a gold version or two-tone. They just made the watch more resilient, more legible, stronger, better bracelet and so on. They just upgraded it. That's not the same as adulterating the form, and it's still definitely a tool watch. They haven't decorated it in any way to try and pretty it up the same way as they've done across the rest of the catalogue. Now at 42 millimeters, that's quite big for a Rolex watch. And normally with the larger watches, they get thicker, like with the Sea Dweller, the James Cameron and so on. But this thing is still slim. It's still 12.5 millimeters and therefore sits beautifully on the wrist. It has a certain charm and a certain beauty, despite it still being just about ruggedness and utility. There's still an audience out there, a certain kind of Rolex fan, who appreciates the original tool watches, loves the Explorer 2, Black Submariner, the regular Explorer 1 for those reasons. These are tool watches supposed to be taken out in the field, and they carry a certain kind of subtle elegance along with them. They don't need to be flashy to be beautiful. So the Explorer 2 represents the end of an era. It's the last traces of what we fell in love with in the first place. Of course, all this could change in a couple of months at Watches and Wonders in Geneva when they announce all the new Rolex models, and we may see a two-tone Explorer 2 or a diamond dial Explorer 2 released, and if that happens, I'm afraid that is the end.